If I start at the very beginning with the overarching research question that the study that I kind of saw from beginning to end was aiming to answer, and that was essentially looking at whether the COVID-19 emergency remote teaching period, you'll see it referred to as ERT, has had any impact at all on how teachers perceive and engage in professional development in the current post-COVID period. Perhaps there has been some effect, perhaps there hasn't. I didn't know at the beginning. The background are the two time periods, COVID, post-COVID, and the subject is, well, I guess the main theme is professional development in its various forms. It actually brings me on to the next slide, which is the literature review. So if we begin with unpacking professional development, what do you see when you conduct a review on PD? Some of the first publications you might see refer to professional development in its traditional event-driven form, very much like the event you find yourselves in now. We're not supposed to call it a conference, but it feels like a conference to me. Workshops, presentations, certificated courses. So this is professional development that is often institutionally recognized. Teachers walk away with something tangible that they can touch at the end of the event, whether it's a certificate, a Moodle badge, something that they can show to their employer to show that they have developed. So the second theme that was explored in the literature review was the notion of digital competence. Now, this is something, the idea of technology in education is not new, was not new during COVID. It had long been experiencing a glacial pace shift as it penetrated higher education. The only difference is that during COVID, it suddenly received an injection of steroids. It was COVID was a catalyst, if you like, for the prominence of technology in universities and colleges. And I should say schools as well. We have many people here who have come from schools across the country. Thirdly, the notion of lifelong learning, again, conducting, I don't want to keep referring to Google Scholar because it's not the be all and end all. However, often you'll come across literature that refers to the notion that we can no longer rest on the laurels of our pre-service training when it comes to being teachers. So think back to the training you did prior to teaching, whether it was a bachelor's in pedagogy, a training certificate, teaching certificate of some kind, a master's, a doctorate. The idea is this is no longer enough to carry you across your career trajectory until you retire. God forbid, not much later than the age of 65, hopefully. But the notion that career sort of teaching is developing so quickly that we need to constantly update our professional development, much more so than pre-COVID. Finally, the last part of the literature review looked at the hybridization of higher education. Again, I don't want to make this too much about higher education because we do have people here from schools, but the notion that it's no longer online versus offline, but actually almost everything we do is hybrid. When was the last time you taught a lesson or you saw a lesson being taught without a smartphone, without a laptop, without a technological component of some kind? I guess you probably can't think of any examples. Let's move on very briefly to the methodology. In other words, what informed how the investigation was conducted. I promised when I submitted the slides, the final letter was not on a subsequent line, but we'll proceed. This is very much a qualitative study, and that stems firstly from the way in which the data was collected. I was lucky enough to have a range of volunteers at the Centre of Preparatory Studies here at CPS, who gave me a very generous amount of their time, perhaps too much. Some of the interviews surpassed an hour. They were semi-structured in that I essentially gave prompts to the teachers and really allowed them to voice their relationship to the phenomenon as they wished, more or less. In this case, the phenomenon being professional development. If you follow on the qualitative sort of thread, the way the data was analysed was also in line with qualitative studies. in the sense that I transcribed all of the audio recordings, which was as painful as it sounds if you don't have the funding for a research assistant. So I listened to my interviews again and again, transcribed everything, and essentially coded in a bid to search for commonalities, but also contrasts as to how my colleagues viewed professional development across both the COVID and the post-COVID time period. Again, you can imagine each individual expresses themselves using different words. So often they were saying the same thing, but it was up to me as the researcher to translate what they were saying as to whether they met in the middle anywhere. Let's move on to the 4 themes. There were lots of themes that were brought about from the data, but 4 is what I could narrow down to such a short presentation today. Firstly, the idea of technology, and again, technology. You can imagine, it's unsurprising, if we look at the first diagram just on the bottom left, teachers reported a notion of survival professional development. So in other words, we didn't have the luxury of signing up to a course, scheduling a presentation, booking rooms on campus to hold training days, as we had long been accustomed to. But actually, teachers reported learning enough to simply get by today without thinking so much about tomorrow. So, I mean, cast your minds back to, was it March 2020, more or less, when we were locked down? Yeah, that's a horrific experience where we were locked in our apartments. Yes, the spring of 2020. So it really did put PD, it really did flip professional development on its head at that stage. The impact that this has reportedly had on the current period that we find ourselves in, what I would call the short to mid-term post-COVID period, is that technology is very much at the forefront of teachers' minds when it comes to professional development. One participant, very polished speaker, and he actually framed it in the notion of a job application, or a job advert rather. Often you have skills in two sections, desirable and essential, right, when you apply for a job. So he described it as COVID essentially facilitated the transition, lubricated the way for technology to shift from desirable, a nice to have, an add-on, to the mandatory essential category. You'd be hard pressed to find teachers now who place technology as a secondary side to have. It's very much shifted in prominence. Teachers are far more likely now to invest their own time and money in professional development that focuses on technology compared to before. Moving on to the second theme. Now, this was particularly tricky to code in that it didn't quite fit into a single theme, at least not at the beginning. What teachers reported about the COVID period was that they were surrounded by so much uncertainty. They were teaching from their apartments or houses. Their students were doing the same. They didn't know how long they were going to be teaching online. They didn't know how to operate the conference management software. So in other words, you're kind of swimming in the dark. That they reported clutching onto the familiar. What was familiar to them were their close-knit support networks, colleagues that they had shared an office with pre-COVID, colleagues who also overlapped perhaps as personal friends. So there was not a lot of talk of branching people's networks during the COVID period due to what I just referred to. So in other words, you're really relying on a set of close-knit connections that you associate a lot of trust to. The impact that this has had on the current period is a particularly interesting one, but slightly sensitive. And that's from the coding I've done, from what I can deduce, teachers are sick and tired, to be frank, of peer-to-peer sharing. So in other words, there's a level of fatigue, it's a sense of hangover, to having spent such a long period simply bouncing ideas off what they perceive to be horizontal level colleagues. So in other words, not a teacher trainer, not somebody below them in the hierarchy, but essentially other teachers. That now what a lot of the participants reported is a yearning for legitimacy and subject matter experts. A lot of the participants, some participants name dropped during this part of the interview. I'm doing a course, inspired by the University of Harvard, University of Cambridge online course. I'm listening to a talk by Dr. So-and-so with a PhD in this field. So there's a lot more emphasis on people with credibility and legitimacy, I should say people and organizations, as a kind of aftershock of what they had to cope with during COVID, which was Jim and John, who they used to share an office with. Moving on to the third theme, the idea of looking at professional development slightly more favorably in the online component. If I can start with the COVID period, you'll recall most of us were flooded with online opportunities, right? Think back to LinkedIn Learning, Coursera, just to name a few. You can tell how enthusiastic I was. I can only remember two. And many of these were either heavily subsidized, if not altogether free. The institutions paid, or in some cases, the course providers themselves saw COVID as an opportunity to gain market share by temporarily waiving the fees, with the hope of, getting teachers hooked, giving somebody a puff of a cigarette and hoping they'll come back to buy more. What this has done, or rather what it did still in the COVID period, is teachers gave, a lot of teachers reported they gave online courses a go. They were stuck in their apartments anyway. It's not as if you could go down to the park or do what you would have customarily have done. You can't book a room. So they experimented, they dabbled in some of these online courses. What that means for the current period we find ourselves in is that there's no longer this dichotomy between face-to-face, superior, first choice, better, and online, second rate, if there's nothing else going, inferior. The line is far more blurred. Many of the teachers I interviewed referred to complementing both. Yes, I'm sure face-to-face is great for all the reasons we're experiencing now. So we're creatures of flesh and blood. It's easier to interact, perhaps. But do you have the money to, or does your institution have the funding rather to pay for you to go to an expensive international conference? Are you going to find a nanny to look after the kids? All the sort of practical niggles that we need to tussle with when attending face-to-face professional development. So a real emphasis on blending the two. Now, before I look at the fourth and final theme, the first three have been reasonably positive. I mean, with the exception of the initial COVID stutter, the scramble, generally have ended with something good, something to add value to the current ERT period we face. The fourth one has not, unfortunately. The fourth one is a cautionary tale. When I asked about any negative elements of professional development, many of the interviewees reported shortcomings on behalf of the institutions. I mean, they're run by people who are flawed the same as us. They reported a hyper focus on technology in isolation from other elements that make us good teachers. So in other words, everybody zoomed in, or at least institutionally, we zoomed in on, let's make sure we can all run a poll on Zoom. Let's make sure we can all use all the advanced features on Moodle, at the expense of pedagogical considerations. Are your students engaged? Are you promoting group work, pair work? Are you reducing teacher talk time? These things took a back seat at the expense of technology. That's not my personal opinion, though I do agree to some degree. That's what was voiced by a majority of the interviewees. Added to that, and you can tell I really did squeeze two themes into one here, is the reported rigidity of the online environment. So teachers reported that they could meet with their colleagues on on Zoom, online. However, there was no spontaneity or fluidity to this. I mean, how spontaneous can a discussion be if you need to schedule it a few days in advance, if you need to use Google Calendar, send a Zoom link? So they reported a diminishing effect when it came to being able to walk home with a colleague part of the way and discuss why a particular lesson that day went well or flopped. There was a real erosion of that spontaneous space during COVID. What that means for today is that if I can draw on an analogy of PTSD, some of the teachers I reported, I don't want to exaggerate, it wasn't all of them, but the majority reported directly or indirectly a sense of trauma associated to the COVID period for different reasons, but mainly with regards to their sense of professionalism. They didn't always feel like professionals, faffing about, trying to get the camera on, unmute themselves. It really took a chip out of their sense of professional pride. Some of these teachers were 20, 30-year veterans in the classroom, and they suddenly felt vulnerable. So what that means today is when we have an online meeting, I mean, I was just in one a couple of days ago. We had a learning and teaching committee meeting that was held online for practical reasons. I think a couple of the members were away. What that means is sometimes online meetings in the current post-ERT period take teachers back to that turbulent yet seminal moment that was from the spring of 2020 up until, when would you say, 2022, more or less, when we started returning. And that really was something, you know, in line with Liz Wilding's, our plenary speaker's notion of firefighters and emergencies. That really kind of speaks to some of those themes. What conclusions can I draw in the last couple of minutes? So, first of all, there is a tension between technology and pedagogy. There are other elements, but mostly between the two. While there are models that exist that look at the integration of the different components that make us good teachers, we've already mentioned subject knowledge, pedagogical skills, technological competence. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Kohler's TPAC model, the TPAC framework for integrating skills. I'm seeing one nod. One is enough, thank you. And that was coined back in 2006. It's almost 20 years ago. So perhaps it is time to revisit the integration of competences. Second conclusion is the significance of establishing a core base, a core support network. I think pre-COVID, we thought about this as a personal preference. Some of us are more introverted, more extroverted than others. And what COVID has shown, according to this research, certainly in my opinion, is that having a core support network of colleagues, friends, previous colleagues is no longer a nice to have. It's no longer something that you can have if you're a chatty individual. It's something that you need. And I'll talk about why in the very final slide. Thirdly, and as I've touched on already, the growing insignificance of learning spaces. When we design a new course, there's often a drop-down box for method of delivery, online, offline. I think this has shown that's a redundant question. It's almost certainly going to be hybrid. The question we should be asking is the balance between online and offline components. In other words, it should be more a percentage, a fraction, however you want to measure it, but I don't think we're going to have many courses in the future that are purely face-to-face, purely online. Fourth and final is the notion that I think is a false choice between structured and unstructured professional development. Do we always need to go to certificated conferences where you walk away with your certificate and you give it to your employer? Or should we be giving a little bit more of a spotlight to the less visible learning practices? Debating a particular pedagogical issue with a colleague, mimicking colleagues. I mean, mimicking's a bit strong, but we do consciously or subconsciously imitate collegial practices that we think are strong. I mean, we may not sit down and think I'm going to do exactly what this teacher has done because I think they're a great teacher, but I think we do subconsciously. And that relates more to the notion of networked learning, less visible sort of day-to-day practices. Very final slide, and I wonder if this slide has the full title at the top. Let's see. Yes, it does. So finish strong. My 5 recommendations, first of all, is to treat emergency remote teaching a little bit like a fire drill. I don't think there will be COVID in its exact shape and form again, but there certainly will be another emergency remote teaching period. Think back to Ebola in West Africa that forced some institutions to cease face-to-face operations. Forget epidemiological, serves me right for trying to pronounce that during a presentation. Forget health-related concerns. Think about the civil disruption in Hong Kong during the recent protests that also forced universities to cease face-to-face operations. It's going to happen again, and therefore we should prepare for it proactively. The second one is touched on already, so I won't repeat myself, the legitimization of day-to-day interaction with colleagues. The counter argument to this is often, we don't have a piece of paper, therefore it's illegitimate. I would push back on that and say, you can keep logs, you can keep journals, you can keep reports, you can turn collegial professional development into presentations, such as this one. You can tangibilize, is that a verb? I'm not sure if you can say that. You can make it tangible, what you learn from bouncing ideas off your colleagues. Thirdly, institutional support often comes down to budget. And this is a thing where people often take a step back and say, if there is money, there's money. If there's no money, there's no money. We don't really need to discuss this. Well, we do. I mean, I don't think that the choice needs to come down to being sat in the office watching a free YouTube video versus being flown business class to a dream conference in Brazil. I think there are compromises in between. I believe our colleagues in Almaty are holding the CAS-T, so it's an English language teaching organization called CAS-T, TEA, in August down in Almaty. Is that right? Yeah. So I mean, that's a regional conference. That's far easier on the purse strings, whether you're paying yourself or institutionally, than flying to sure, we'd all love to go to Costa del Sol or Rio de Janeiro, but you know, to offer some compromise. Fourthly, and I know my moderators are staring daggers as I go over time, but fourthly, broadening PD focal points. Some teachers do venture away from, say, EAP in this case, but that's not necessarily a bad thing for them to pivot towards instructional design, curriculum, assessment specialization. What institutions can do in order to signal is create a priority list. Should finish that sentence. In order to signal what their needs are. So that there can be a list of high priority professional development areas that they would particularly value their teachers to engage in, and then work down the list. Lastly, I think a frank and honest recognition that whilst a lot was done right during COVID, and we're all very appreciative, I think, of what our universities, schools and colleges did for us, evidently not everything was perfect. I mean, there were tussles and there were things that went wrong. And I think often, you know, one of the early stage treatments for PTSD is recognizing that the trauma you went through is in fact real trauma. So I think that's where we can start. With that, I'll apologize again for going a few minutes over, and I'd welcome any questions from you.